Welcome! This is a video to show you the absolute basics of creating a small Python graphical user interface program or GUI program. So when I click run here, you'll see that a little window pops up and it will display some tips for a video game. So for example, mine is for Minecraft here. And if I click next tip, it'll swing through and go on to the next one and show the next tip there. Now the idea is to sort of mimic in modern video games how if there's a loading screen, they'll often display some game tips in the top left corner or somewhere like that to give you something to do, something productive to do while you're waiting for the loading screen. And usually you can press a button to go on to the next tip if you have time. So obviously we're not going to actually create a modern video game with tips in the corners, but we're just using this as a bit of a fun background for getting into the basics of GUI programming. So you should choose a game that you like, or it could be tips about something else, doesn't necessarily have to be a video game, and you can follow along and do your own topic in with the coding that I show you. For this project, we will be using a free online tool called Code Sculptor 3. This is not something you would create a professional app with, but it's a fantastic way of learning. It's a simple web-based Python coding environment that's ideal for creating basic graphical Python programs with a GUI interface. And what we mean by a GUI, a graphical user interface, is when we hit run, is we have a window and we have buttons we can click and we have a canvas that the program can draw to. So let's have a quick look at Code Sculptor 3 and how it works. So first of all, just so you know, if you hit save, it will actually change the URL at the top of the screen. You can't see it here, but you'll see on your computer. And what you need to do is once you've hit save the first time is you need to bookmark that page. So if you click on the star in the address bar, that will create a bookmark for you, and then you can go back to your project anytime you like. Every time you make a change and then you hit save again, it will actually keep the same address except the last number will change from a 0 to a 1 to a 2 to a 3, and so it will actually keep all of your different versions in there of your program, so you can go back to previous versions if you like. If there's something that you don't know how to do in Code Sculptor 3, it is very well documented. If you click the docs here, it will open up, and if you go to graphics modules and canvas, those are most of the things you'll probably want: how to draw text, how to draw images, etc., etc. But definitely this graphics module section is the one that you want. Now, a graphical user interface is not something that's built into Python directly. So you'll see here in this little example program that is up on the screen when you go to Code Sculptor 3, you actually have to import Simple GUI. And if you go on to make other GUI programs later, you'll probably use a different library that will work a little bit differently. But this is a really nice, easy way to get started. Let's have a look at this example program here. If I click run, it says welcome, and when I click on the click me button, it changes to good job. So I'm going to go through this step by step just to have a quick idea of roughly how GUI programs are set up, because it's a little bit different to a command line Python program. So first, you can see here we've imported Simple GUI, the library, then we've just created a variable and called it welcome. Now keep in mind that does not draw it onto the screen or anything like that. It's just stored in the machine under the name message. Now, what we have here are two functions. One of them is called click, and it doesn't have to be called click, but this function is basically what runs when you press this button here. And then the draw function is what runs 60 times a second when your monitor is ready to redraw or to refresh. Now, those don't automatically happen on clicks and draw. That's what this next section is, which is setting up the frame. So this is the frame. So frame, we've just called it frame. We could have called it my frame or window or something like that. It's up to you, but we've called it frame here equals simplegui.createFrame, so that'll create the new frame for us. The first parameter here is what it's called in the top left-hand section there. then we have the width and the height in pixels. Now the next thing that's done in this program is they've added a button onto the frame. This is what it says on the button, as you can see here. And this is the function that will run when the button is pressed. So I said this didn't have to be called click, you could call it button press or something like that, as long as you put the same name in here. Then we have to tell Simple GUI which function we want to run 60 times a second, and we've told it that that's the draw function here. And then the final thing that's happened is we start the frame. So this behaves a little bit differently from a text-based command line Python program. Basically, all of this setup happens pretty much instantaneously, and then all the code that gets run after that point is in these functions that we call them callbacks. So the program actually calls back into our code when either a click happens or the screen is ready to draw. So you can imagine every time there's a click, this function will run. Every time the screen's ready to redraw, this function will run. And another word for this is event-driven programming. So it's basically the idea that these functions run when certain events happen within the program, whether it be a button click or user input or the mouse moving or something like that. It's a little bit of a different way of thinking about things, but you will get used to it after a period of time. So looking at our example program here, we can probably use a lot of this code because it does some things quite similar to what we want. It does something when we click, so we'll keep that. It draws some text on the screen, so we can keep that. But there are some aspects that we want to change. So for example, the name up in the corner here, the writing on the button, the window dimensions will need to be longer and less high. And also we'll want the text maybe a different color in a different spot, etc. So let's start making some changes. First of all, we can get rid of the message variable because we're going to be doing things a little bit differently. We're going to have a long list of tips. Second of all, we can, seeing as though we're not changing the message variable in click, we can just put pass because you have to put something in a Python function. You can't leave it empty. Second or third, wherever we're up to, I think that the screen here, when we create the frame, no, we won't be able to. Actually, we'll need to change this message. Let's just change the message variable just to the string tip. And then we should just have the word tip appear here, just for the moment. Let's change up here where it says home. I'm going to change mine to Minecraft tips, but you can change it to whatever the title of yours is. And I think instead of making it 300 pixels wide and 200 pixels high, I will make mine a little bit wider and much shorter. So I'll do 70 for mine. So if we click run again, you'll see that now our window here is wider, shorter, and has your title in the corner here, hopefully. Okay, what other changes do we need? I think the button will say next tip. So that looks a little bit more authentic now. And another thing you'll notice now is that we've changed the screen size is that the text no longer appears in the screen because it's been drawn too far down. The Y value, which is 0 here and increases as we go down, is too high and it's being drawn down there. So let's change where we draw it. Instead of 50, which is from the left, I'm going to draw it further to the left and much closer to the top. So let's say 40. I'll also make the text a little bit smaller than 48. I'm going to make mine 20. Okay, so you can see here now that we're in the middle, just a little bit off the left, and we have a lot of room here to display our tip. Now, I don't really believe that red is a great color for this. I would like something that's a little bit more relaxed and loading screen-like. So what you can do is you can go to color picker. You can just Google color picker, and you can move your slider along the left to choose the hue, and then once you've found one that you like, you can change the level of light and dark, the brightness and the saturation in here. So up and down is light and dark, and left and right is saturated and desaturated. So you can find something that you think would look nice. Once you've done that, you can actually just hit the copy button here, and you can go back into your program here, and you can, instead of red, you can paste that in there. And then hopefully you will get that color. So I just paused there and just changed the color slightly. I made it a little bit more towards the aqua or the turquoise and a little bit brighter, just so it showed up better on the background there. So the next step is to start getting some tips drawn onto the screen. Now we are going to want to have a long list of tips. So prior to when we changed this, we had message as a variable. I'm going to create another variable called tips, but it's not going to be a string this time. It's going to be a list which is created with these square brackets. And I can actually put this down a few lines so I can put the list top to bottom, which is a little bit easier to read for sentences than scrolling off the edge of the page here. And I'm going to put several tips. I'm going to type them in. So for example, the tip might be, for Minecraft anyway, torches hold up sand and gravel. Now you can make these tips either out of your own memory or knowledge of a game, or alternatively you might like to look up, do a Google search on top 20 or top 50 tips for that particular game. You might need to rephrase them so that they're short enough that they're going to fit into your screen here. But I'll leave it up to you how you decide to get the tips. And you're probably going to want to have at least 5 or 6 here, but preferably more. So I've done a bit of research. I've looked up at several websites to get some tips. Obviously, if you're making a professional program, you want to acknowledge your sources for things, but we're just doing an imaginary little practice project just to learn Python. So we're not going to be really publishing, or you're not going to be publishing yours anywhere. So we don't need to worry as much about that. So I've got my five sentences there. Now, what I would like to do is my final goal is to get all of these cycling through when we hit run here. But in programming, it's really good to break things up into smaller steps. So the first step for me is just to get the first item of the list printing. So down here is where what we're printing. If I type in the list tips here and hit run, it's going to say, I'm sorry, the text must be a string. We can't print out a list, we need a string. So the list is full of strings, so how do we get the first item of the string here? And the way you get the first item is with these square brackets, and you might think that you put the number 1 in, but lists actually start at 0. So we put 0, that will be the first item here. If we wanted the second item, we would actually put 1, because it starts at 0 and goes 0, 1, 2. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. A little bit weird, but you'll get used to it. At programming, that happens a lot. So if you hit run, now you'll see that the tip actually comes up, and which is great, but unfortunately we can't click the next tip. So what we want to happen is that when we click on the button, this 0 changes to a 1, which will show the next tip, and then it will change to a 2, which will show the next tip, etc. So if we want this to vary, we need to make it a variable. And what we're doing when we change the 0 to a 1 and a 2, that's called the index of the list. So I'm going to make a variable called index. That's not part of the programming language, I just came up with that word. You could call it something else. You could call it num for number, or I, or something like that, but I'm going to call it index. In fact, I might be lazy and just call it I, which is a common programming thing. Or actually, if we want to be more descriptive, we could call it tip num. That might be tip number. So you're going to go into the list of tips and choose the tip number out of there that we're doing. Let's do that. Okay, so what we want to do now is at the start of the program, we want to set tip num to the first one, which is 0. And now when we hit run, it should be the 0th one, or the first one there, which is correct. If I set tip 1 to 1, the next one, it should be a different one, which it is, which is good. So how do we then inside click, how do we change tip num? Well, the first thing is in Python, inside a function, if you want to change a global variable, this is a global variable, which means it's defined at the start of the program outside a function, so it exists in the whole program. If we want to change that inside a function, we need to say global tip num. That means go and get the global variable tip num. I might be changing it. And then we can just say, this function here will only run when we click the button, right? So we can say tip num plus equals 1. Now, that will work for a little while, but then there will be a problem. We run into a problem, and it says up here, index error, list index out of range. So what happened was, we looked at the 0th, first, second, third, fourth, then it tried to go and look at the next one, but there was no next one, and so the program crashed. So what we can say is we could say if tip num, this is after we change it by 1, if tip num is greater than, let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so if it's greater than 4, then we're going to put tip num to equal 0. And now if we hit next tip, it will be going back to 0 each time. And if you want to really see what's going on, you could always just print tip num each time, and it will come in the output here. So every time we click next tip, you'll see it's going back through the numbers there. Now that's all very nice, but what if we want to add more to the length of the list here later? Well, we can make this a little bit more robust. So we could say if tip num is greater than the length of the list, and now the length of that list is 5, and we said if it was more than 4, so let's say the length of tips minus 1, and that's because it starts at 0, so it's off by 1. We have to be a little bit careful. So if tip number is greater than the length of tips minus 1, or if you wanted to be really clever, you could say greater than or equal to tips, then set it back to 0. And now the exact same thing should happen, but if we added another element in here, okay, I'm just going to put that for the moment. Oops. Then it will still work, and you'll notice it's going all the way up to 5 now. Okay, so I'm going to take this out, but it's just a little bit more stable, I guess. If you make changes to the program, it's not going to cause unintended consequences. All right, so this is working quite well, but there's probably one more major change that we would like to make. And that is every time there's a loading screen, we probably don't want to start with the same tip here. We want a random tip. But at the same time, if you just always choose a random tip, then maybe when you click next tip, you get the same tip again and there's no change. And that wouldn't be very good for the players. So I think the best thing that we can do is we can just shuffle this list at the start of every program, or every time it runs. So to shuffle something, we're going to need to import the random module. So if we type in import random, and that'll get a whole lot more functionality that comes with than what comes with Python to do with random numbers. Now, once we've created at the start of each program our list of tips here, we're then going to say random.shuffle and give it the name of the list to shuffle, and it will just take this list, shuffle them up, and then when we start printing the 0th or the first element, it should be a different one each time. Let's try that out. So if we click on run, hopefully it's not torches. No, it's not. So it's water makes a good lawnmower. If we hit run again, well, there was a 1 in 5 chance or 6 chance or whatever of that happening, but we've got the same one again running the whole program. Torches hold up to sand and gravel. Okay, so every time, now I know we had a repeat one when we ran the whole program again, but what we won't have now is a repeat one when we click the button, because what it's doing is it's shuffling up the list. Again, if we want to see what it's doing, we could actually print here the list of tips, and you can see here that it says soul sand, water, torches, and if we run it again, it says torches, torches, signs. So you can see that the list is getting mixed up each time. So I'm just going to get rid of that print for our final release build of the product. Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this very basic introduction to Python GUI programming. You can play around and add some things yourself. You could obviously add a lot more tips here. You might even like to have a look in the documentation here and see if you could show a little tip icon or image or something like that, but it is a little bit of a challenge. I have other projects where I show you how to do images, but basically just put your own stamp on it. Try and find some interesting tips from a game of your choice, and I will see you in a future project.